It's that time of year again. Everyone knows that the holidays can become overwhelming quickly, so the sooner that you get things done, the better. For both shoppers and businesses, the best time to score great deals during the holidays is Black Friday and Cyber Monday weekend. And that's why you need Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S., from household names like Allbirds and Cowboy e-bikes to entrepreneurs who will be participating in their very first Black Friday or Cyber Monday this year. Shopify has everything you need to succeed from start to finish. First, Shopify's marketing tools help push your brand to the forefront of the chaos, no matter what platform your customers are on. Then, Shopify helps draw customers in with the ease of a convenient checkout with Shop Pay, Shopify's expedited checkout that saves customers information and reduces hassle. The best part? Shop Pay has been proven to boost conversions, meaning you see less abandoned carts and more profits. You can also stress less knowing that Shopify's award-winning customer support team is on standby 24/7 to help with any issues that arise, allowing you to get back to business as fast as possible. This Black Friday, join thousands of new entrepreneurs hearing for the first time with Shopify. Sign up for your free trial today at shopify.com/income. That's shopify.com/income. Go to shopify.com/income and make this Black Friday one to remember.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. As we've seen, places are important in presidential history, and some are so important that they require a second look. A few months ago, we had a guest on the podcast who was able to share insights into the operational side of the presidential retreat dubbed Camp David. In this episode, I talk with another guest about this facility from more of a historical lens. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. My guest for this episode, Charles Ferguson, spent 3.5 years as the Camp David historian and presidential chaplain. During that time, he coordinated with 14 presidential libraries to better tell the true story of the president's exclusive mountaintop retreat, scouring records and memoirs for engaging stories, providing glimpses into the hidden world of Camp David. Conducting hundreds of tours for personal guests of the president, his accessible storytelling draws you into the wonders of Camp David as if you're walking the historical private trails with your own personal tour guide. His writings have appeared on the Faith and Leadership website and in the Presbyterian Outlook, Presbyterians Today, and the United States Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine. I'll have a link to find out more about Charles and his work, including his newly released book, Presidential Seclusion, The Power of Camp David, on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Thanks so much to Charles for his time and the insight that he provided for this episode. And without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my conversation with Charles.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the creator of Homeland, Claire Danes and Matthew Rhys star in the new Netflix series, The Beast in Me, as ruthless rivals whose shared darkness will set them on a collision course with fatal consequences. The Beast in Me is a riveting psychological cat and mouse story about guilt, justice, and doubt. You will not want to miss this. The Beast in Me is now playing only on Netflix.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you, Jerry.
Absolutely. And first of all, congratulations on the publication of your book. As our listeners will learn in the course of this conversation, it is an amazing book, an amazing research into the history of this presidential retreat that I think we're all familiar with, but to really start to see what makes it special. And it really comes across in your book that this is a special place. And as we'll see, different presidents approached it different ways.
Yeah, it's hard for people to really understand it without a book like this because it's been so secretive and not a lot of people talk about it when they come out or when they do. It's in fits and starts. And so you have to do a lot of deep research to find the nuggets that went into the book. And I'm looking forward to talking to your audience and sharing it with some historians.
Excellent. Well, and that is a perfect place to start because at the beginning of your book, you talk about what we know about Camp David's history. And you wrote that, quote, many legends of dubious provenance were floating around among the staff. So it made sense to conduct detailed research on the tall tales to confirm or deny their validity. So, Charles, would you mind sharing more about your motivation to explore Camp David's history and what led to you writing this book?
Absolutely. Being the historian at Camp David was such an amazing experience. And one of the things I was able to do was to give walking historical tours of the retreat to any of the president's guests. And as you're walking around giving historical tours to the most influential people in the world, you get a little surprised when they're in awe of what you're telling them, and seeing the looks of wonder and awe on their face, and just the realization for them to realize or recognize that they were literally walking in the footsteps of history was such an amazing experience for me. And it showed just how fascinating and important the history of Camp David is. And I would go home and relate those stories to my wife. And she finally one day said, well, why don't you just put the stories you're telling, these historical stories you're telling, down to paper? And so I did that. And that's what became the book. But as you mentioned in your question, I had to do a lot of research with the presidential libraries, presidential memoirs, just thousands of pages of documents, sorting through it to make sure that what I put in the book was correct and not just any rumor that I'd heard from a guest or from the legends that get passed down. And there are a few legends that I kept in the book because they were just too good not to share. But I did clearly state this is probably not exactly true. So take those stories with a grain of salt. But it was just seeing the reaction on people's faces in this magical place, and how the spirit of Camp David, something we'll probably talk about later, how that worked onto people, made it almost like I had to write the book to share it with the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as our listeners know, there is so much of presidential history that is this lore. And whenever you start to really research it, you find there may be a nugget of truth there, but then there are also the wild tales that it's like, yeah, this just didn't happen, but it's become part of the lore. And it's also important, like you said, to include just because they're good stories, but then also it helps us to understand, how this lore came about and what that means for our perceptions of the presidents.
Right. And the danger for me was there's not a lot of information out there. So if I had to put a legend out, it might be taken as truth. So I really had to do the research to make sure what was myth and what was fact, and separating those two in the book.
Absolutely. Well, starting with something that is very firm in your history, because you served as the 10th chaplain at Camp David. So, Charles, would you mind sharing what this unique term of service was like for you, and how did it impact your life and your spiritual vocation?
Well, being even nominated to be the chaplain at Camp David came as a complete surprise. A random email one day that my wife thought was spam, and wasn't sure how the process would work out. But after I was selected and got to go there, I became the chaplain, I was the pastor, the chaplain to the President of the United States and their invited guests, as well as the staff that works at the retreat. So obviously a lot of vetting and things that occur with that. But when you're there, it's just this amazing experience to work with some of the best and brightest people in the United States military, who are all handpicked, hand-selected, and provide this 5-star level of service to anybody that comes through the gate, whether the president's there or not. So to work with such a stellar group of individuals obviously made me a better person, raised the level of service that I was providing to meet what they were doing. But it was also amazing just to see the president and their guests. Like I said in the first question, these influential people that come, and their whole goal is to relax and to maybe conduct business, high level negotiations. Everything's used however the president wants to, but to be a fly on the wall as they're walking around and getting to know them and seeing how this place changes someone, it's hard not to have it change you both spiritually and professionally. So it was just an amazing experience to be up there for 3.5 years.
Well, and I'm really glad that you figured out that email was not spam. Well, and going to a phrase that you brought up, this phrase, the spirit of Camp David, it comes up multiple times in your work. Would you mind sharing where that phrase comes from, what it means, and how it has manifested in the history of the presidential retreat?
Absolutely. And the spirit of Camp David, that term is an all-encompassing thing about the feeling you get when you are up inside the gates on this mountain. You know, just to set the stage, you drive up through a national park. If you come via car, you drive through a national park, you go through security, and then you enter the gates, and there's just this peaceful feeling about you. It's just as if nature kind of wraps around and just says, I've got you. It's a little security blanket. But the weight of the world tends to drop away because how isolated and secure you are and safe, you know, within the security perimeter. This phrase "spirit of Camp David" was first used in 1959 by Nikita Khrushchev, which I find just fascinating that our mortal enemy at the time, the Soviet Union, the premier of the Soviet Union, who was apprehensive to come up to Camp David because he wasn't sure if it was a prison camp or what it would be. He had some negative feelings about it until his staff researched. But he came up, stayed a few days with Eisenhower, actually stayed in Eisenhower's presidential cabin up there. And he used the term to describe just how easy it was on the mountain to connect on a personal level and discuss important matters at this retreat. And so that's the spirit of Camp David. He coined the phrase, public enemy number one of the United States says, this is an amazing place and it has this spirit to it. And that feeling keeps coming up over and over again throughout its history. And people have used the spirit of Camp David as a phrase throughout. Most recently, when President Biden had the Koreans and the Japanese up there, they named their declaration of their meeting the spirit of Camp David. Because when you get up there, your guard is down. So the camp lowers the barriers and you get to be yourselves, which allows for amazing and world-changing things and events to occur, agreements to occur up on that mountain.
Well, and as our listeners know, I'm very much somebody who loves to travel to historic sites and presidential sites because there's something about being in those special places and being connected to that energy it's astounding. And for you, having that experience for years, being there, it definitely comes across in your book that it made a huge impact on you.
It did. And it was hard to get bored with the job when you knew that when you got up on top of the mountain, you would have this peaceful feeling. And you knew that as you're walking around, you literally were walking in the footsteps of history, what I would tell to the guests. To be enveloped in that historical spirit every day for 3.5 years, it was an amazing time of my life. And I'm glad I got to do it. And, you know, you do kind of miss it a little bit and other people, you know, it's their turn now. But like you said, every historical site has its own feel to it. And if you've gone to other places that are large in the imagination, such as Pearl Harbor or the World Trade Center, they have their own different feel to it. This one is more of a upbeat, relaxing, peaceful feel. And I think that comes from so many peace deals and negotiations and bridges have been built between enemies in this space that you just feel it as you're walking around.
Well, and going to the beginning of Camp David, you know, this was a presidential retreat, you know, originally known as Shangri-La, that was a wartime innovation in presidential operations during World War II. And it's always fascinating to think of, that this was born out of necessity for the president to be able to get away, but also be secure at a time where the presidential yacht was probably not the right place to go. And it was interesting because I loved how you put it into the context of these changes in what was going on with the presidency and the infrastructure surrounding the presidency. You mentioned, of course, Shangri-La, but also the Signal Department, now known as the White House Communications Agency, and how this was integrated into operations at Shangri-La. So I was wondering, Charles, if you would share with our audience how this infrastructure supporting the presidency changed in the course of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency and what role the presidential retreat played in that.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it was born out of necessity. The fact that Roosevelt was looking for a place to relax because the presidency is with you everywhere. And especially in the summer, a lot of people don't realize that Washington, D.C. is built on a swamp. And so it's oppressive in the summer. So most presidents throughout history have left D.C. at some point in the summer just for cooler climates, a more refreshing place. And during the war, Roosevelt needed a place that wasn't too far away because he was asking people to sacrifice with rationing of fuel and things like that. But he also wanted a cool mountain retreat. And so I talk about it in the book, but they settle on Camp David, or what would become Camp David. It was called High Catoctin Camp 3, part of the Works Progress Administration that Roosevelt had signed into existence only 9 years earlier. So kind of full circle with the Roosevelt New Deal here. But when he was traveling during war, they still needed to keep track of what was going on around the world when he wasn't at the center of the government in D.C. And he had been making trips to Hyde Park and down to Warm Springs, Georgia, his two other retreats. And the signals detachment came up with the idea of doing communications like a car for the train. They would just latch it on to couple it up to the presidential train as it went to north or south so that Roosevelt could stay in constant communication whenever he was traveling. Well, they took that idea and the technology for that and just put it on a fixed spot at the mountain up at what was then called Shangri-La, so that whenever anything would happen, the president could be informed of things that were going on. And one of the stories I relay in the book is soon after this communication setup was constructed, Roosevelt or Harry Hopkins, it's not really sure who was asking for it, but someone wanted to listen to Hitler speak. And they told the signal detachment, this is what we want. And because they had the communication gear on there, just in the nick of time, they were able to flip the switch, and all of a sudden, German starts coming over the airwaves live from Hitler's speech. So they were able to, in real time, hear what Hitler was saying unfiltered. And that was a huge win for the members of the signal detachment. And one of the reasons they probably still are there today, with the military being the signal, the providers of communications for the president 24/7 anywhere around the world. If you hear the president, see the president, the White House Communication Agency has a part in that.
Well, and it's amazing to think about, the things that we take for granted nowadays, and that this was a time that they were having to figure out all these things. How do you get that, simulcast from Germany? How do you make all this communication happen? How do you make sure that the president stays informed when they're traveling, and knowing that travel was different in those days? It wasn't just you hop on a plane. Sometimes you were going by car, sometimes you were going by train. And I do love how you help to integrate that story and help us to understand as readers that this was when all of this was starting to come together.
Oh, absolutely. And I put that chapter in the book and there's also a chapter about the Marines, because Camp David is more than just the buildings. It's more than the presidents. It's the people that work there that help foster the spirit of Camp David and allow the president and their guests to do what they need to do, whatever that is, be it relaxation, playing or bowling, watching movies, skeet shooting, or real serious negotiations that will affect a lot of things in the world, like the Camp David Accords, 2000 when President Clinton brought Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat for a discussion, or the G7 summit that happened in 2012. So all of that comes in, and it's about more than just the building and the famous people that are there. The people that make the trains run on time, so to speak, are very important to the story as well.
Absolutely. And it's so fascinating in your book to go through and kind of see how different presidents approach this retreat. And you noted that with numerous presidents, there was a change in their thoughts about the benefits of Camp David after their initial visit. So, Charles, what did some of those changes of heart look like? And why do you think Camp David has been retained as an active facility for the use of the president?
It's interesting you mentioned the change of heart, but there was one president that did not really change his mind from the first visit, and that was Truman. He went up there, felt claustrophobic because he's a Kansas boy. He's used to, wide open spaces, and he was seeing trees, and he asked a way to make it less claustrophobic, and the staff jumped to and cut a notch out so he could see out to the countryside, but also cleared a lot of the trees behind the president's cabin so he could see the open space and feel more at home. But he still never took a liking to it. And I bring that up because even though he didn't really get settled in and find that spiritual home at Camp David like most of the other presidents did, he didn't shut it down. And there was a lot of worry that he would shut it down because the war was over. He didn't like it. He did open it up to his staff and let them use it, but it still worked. Like the spirit of Camp David, the necessity of that retreat, not just for him, but for his staff, outweighed the discomfort he had or the dislike he had from his first visit. Some of the others weren't so sure about using it for a while. Carter is one of those. He came and his advisors had told him before he took office, hey, you need to save some money. Let's work, let's start getting rid of some of these things. And he was set on getting rid of the camp, or at least shutting it down during his tenure. And one of the advisors, a Republican advisor from a former president, said, just wait, just give it a second and see what you think. Go up there, give it a chance. He went up there, gave it a chance, and he didn't get rid of it. Obviously, the Camp David Accords happened there. He got there and realized just how magical the place was and what it could do, not just for him personally, but in terms of what it could do for diplomacy. And he was absolutely right, as the Camp David Accords are still standing over 40 years later. And Carter would use the place 99 times over his 4 years. So he was an avid user of it for relaxation as well. So those are just two of the ways in which the status of the camp really worked with changing hearts and minds of presidents.
Well, and it's interesting because so much diplomacy that's happened over the course of the last few decades that Camp David has been there, and, so many world leaders, so much important history there. But I do have to say, one of the stories that intrigued me in the course of your book was when Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson visited in April 1965 during Lyndon Johnson's presidency. So I couldn't resist. Would you mind sharing more with our audience about that visit and how it fits into the context of Johnson's presidency at the time?
That story is one of the ones that I found very interesting in my research as well. I had no idea it had happened. It was not part of the history that had been passed down from historian to historian. And so as I'm digging through files, I come across an article, and I can't remember what magazine it was, that detailed this visit, and it was written by one of Prime Minister Pearson's aides. And so to set the stage, in April of 1965, the Canadian Prime Minister came to the United States on a speaking tour and had been making speeches throughout the country. And to even set the stage even more, he was on Johnson's good list. he had been invited to the ranch in Texas to spend time with Johnson, which is probably the highest honor you could get from Lyndon Johnson, to be invited to his home state and being shown around the ranch. And so it was, I want to say April 3rd, 1965, Pearson gives a speech at a college in Philadelphia, and he gently criticizes the U.S. approach to the Vietnam War. Wasn't an outright rebuke, but it wasn't a glowing, overwhelming, this is the right thing to do. And Lyndon Johnson did not like that at all. But he kept quiet. So the next day, the visit to Camp David still occurs, and Prime Minister Pearson arrives, but there's no president to greet him at the helipad. Usually that's the first sign something is going wrong. Prime Minister gets escorted to lunch with the president, and while there, Lady Bird is talking to him, trying to keep the conversation, because President Johnson has decided to take phone calls and make unimportant phone calls right in front of the prime minister, further showing, like, I'm not happy. Well, after lunch, the aides for both the president and the prime minister decide to leave to let the two men talk and do what they need to do. I don't know how long they're gone, at least 30 minutes, maybe an hour. They come back and the aides retell the story of how they walk in, and through the windows, they see President Johnson for more or less assaulting the Canadian prime minister. I think he's got him pushed up against the wall and pointing at him and yelling. You just see the anger on Johnson's face. And so Johnson essentially let the meeting still go so he could just let the prime minister have an earful about what was going on. Well, after Johnson gets done berating and physically attacking the Canadian prime minister, Johnson's all buddy and walks him to the helipad to see him off like a normal president would, joking and shaking his hand like nothing had happened. It was just a wild story. But if you learn more about Johnson and his presidency and his temperament, it fits right into everything I've read about Johnson, because learning this story, I had to read more to figure out if this was something that he would do, if it was in character or out of character. And I think it probably was closer to in character than out of character for Johnson.
It sounds like full-on Johnson treatment. He is definitely, in studying presidential history, he's one that you end up with a lot of interesting stories like this. Well, I'm glad the Canadian Prime Minister made it out relatively unscarred. Well, and it's interesting because, while going through how each president used Camp David, a thread ran through the history in your book about how the press approached the presidential visits. So would you mind speaking about how this relationship between the press and the president while at the retreat changed over time?
Well, I will start out by saying, I don't think the president, regardless of political party and time period, has ever had a good relationship with the press. They always complain about them, and they're always finding ways to pull one over on the press. And so that's the thread I saw throughout in my research, is the way that the presidents would try to obscure things from the press or get mad if the press reported on them. FDR, they called in some reporters who did a story about the location of Camp David. They called reporters in, almost arrested them under the Espionage Act during World War II, because they didn't like the fact that people had found out that the president was going to a retreat. Even though they had the location wrong and the description wrong, they still didn't like that idea. During the Nixon administration, the press, over the years, the press would go and stay in a town right down the mountain called Thurmont, a wonderful town in Maryland. And they stayed at this, most of the time they would stay at this place called the Cozy Inn. It just became the gathering spot. So while the president was at Camp David, the White House pool would stay down the mountain and wait for word of anything to happen. And if something happened, they would be summoned up to Camp David, which never would happen because the president's not going to tell the press what's going on. Or they would hear about it and then follow their stories from the Cozy Inn in Thurmont. But during the Nixon administration, they were trying to, I guess, help with press relations, but it didn't go so well. They had cut out this little viewing box in the fence that the press derogatorily called the duck blind. And they would look and get to see the president land or take off, and that was it. And that's all the information they would get. Ford takes over after Nixon's resignation and is bluntly asked, what are you going to do to help with the press, especially up at Camp David? And so they build a press trailer, and all the buildings at Camp David are named after local plants. And originally the building that the press was in was called Poison Ivy. And so you can tell that's, indicative of the relationship between the presidency and the press. Well, during Ford's presidency, in response to that question, he changes the name to honeysuckle, which it's a sweet smelling flower, but it's the most invasive plant on the mountain. And so
little subtle dig there.
Yeah, a little zinger, a little backhanded compliment. Like, okay, we'll help you out. We'll change the name, but we're gonna, insult you at the same time. and then Ford did invite Harry Reasoner onto the grounds for a video interview that unfortunately never aired because of scheduling conflicts. And then I think the final straw, and I mentioned this in the book, the final straw with the press coming to Thurmont and being up there for Camp David was during George H.W. Bush's time. He had a health scare, and the press up in Thurmont had no idea it happened. The press in D.C. got word of the president being in Bethesda before the reporters that were supposed to cover all this knew. And at that point, a lot of the press agency started not funding the trips up to Camp David. And so now the press does not come up. They don't hang out in Thurmont unless there's a big event. And then the White House will invite them up, as happened in 2023 when President Biden had the Japanese and the Korean leaders up as well. So on those special occasions, you will still have press come up, but it's tightly scripted, as you probably saw if you've watched that press conference. It's a very scripted, this is where you go, this is where you're going to stand, this is what we're going to, this is how long you're going to talk kind of thing. And then they are quickly sent right back off the mountain to go do their job and follow their reports.
Well, and it was interesting reading this in your book, and the fact that it took decades before they finally realized there's not really any reason for us to be here. They were just hoping that something would happen.
Well, also, I think it was inevitable no matter what, just communication became wider and wider. And, now with the internet, there's really no reason to do that because the White House can reach out instantaneously from Camp David to talk to anybody, or can broadcast from Camp David if they need to, which you've seen some press conferences over the past few years from Camp David live. So the need for the press corps up there isn't as great, but they still will be up there if they ever decide to do another G7. Obviously, the press will be up there because the press was up there for the G7 in 2012 as well.
Well, and it's interesting because especially for the presidents who focus on this idea of Camp David as a retreat and just trying to get away from things, you can understand, they don't want there to be a lot of news there. And you talk about how some of the presidents were very private about their times at Camp David. And in particular, you talked about the Reagans. You wrote at one point that, quote, if not for the detailed descriptions of Camp David from President and Mrs. Reagan in their memoirs, there would be scant information on their use of the camp because of their dogged determination to guard the retreat's privacy. So, Charles, would you mind talking about how this level of privacy varied amongst the presidents?
Yes, I think the privacy for most all of the presidents is pretty tight. They're not going to invite just anybody up there when they're up there. They're not going to publicize the big events. George H.W. Bush, in his memoir, or not his memoirs, in Barbara's memoirs, because George H.W. Bush didn't write any memoirs, she mentioned how they specifically would not talk about any famous people that they invited up because they didn't want them to be attacked unfairly for associating with the president or being too political. So all of them keep that privacy and guard it. And that's one of the reasons that Camp David is so special for the first family, because they can go up there and be themselves without anybody essentially knowing. They may know they're there, but they don't know what's going on. The Reagan story I found so ironic because both of them were such public people before they came into office. Reagan's an actor and he's famous for his films, and he even did films when he was in the army in World War II. Like that was his role in World War II in the army. So he's this public figure in Hollywood, former Nancy Davis, now Nancy Reagan, obviously an actress herself. So you have this famous actor family, and when he becomes president and they're the first family, they just lock it all down. To me, I find that so ironic and interesting. That was an interesting thread for me. Reagan would want to go to his ranch in California or Camp David, and he went to Camp David all the time because it was closer. But when he went, it was just him, Nancy, select members of the staff that had to be there, and that was it. His children rarely came up. There were 3 foreign leaders that were allowed to visit, and none of them stayed the night. Margaret Thatcher came twice, President of Mexico, and the Prime Minister of Japan. That was it in 8 years of foreign leaders. So they really locked it down. And then George H.W. Bush would keep the people that came up private, but one day it's very private, very few people coming. The next day, George H.W. Bush is like, this is a family retreat. My family's going to come. We're going to do all of these amazing things together as a family. Bush built a playground right beside a horseshoe pit he installed so he could watch the grandkids play while he was doing his favorite activity. It goes back and forth between the personality of the president, the real personality of the president, not the one that is on TV. And I think that was the thing that really struck me with Reagan. I expected him to be more open about it because he's such a gregarious personality on TV, but in private, he was very quiet. And you see that with the way in which the presidents use the place. Their true personality comes out in how they use it and what they use it for. Some of them, they're all business and want to use it mostly for work and retreats or like work retreats, or negotiations. Eisenhower is one of those. He came up frequently, but he used it more for work, kind of like the office away from the office, because his home that he was building, that is now a national park itself, was in Gettysburg, just 15 miles away. So he would go to Gettysburg for family time and relaxation, but use Camp David for work. And so, as you said, it depends on the president, but it's not exactly the use that you would expect if you looked at them and their public persona. It's how their private persona would want to use it.
Absolutely. And that's a great lead into my next question, because, as you said, depending on the president, they took different approaches to it. Some would use it as a place to gather with their staff, while others saw it as this personal retreat, and still others, of course, we talked about, focusing on this setting for diplomatic negotiations. And so, given their different approaches and what you found in the course of your research, what are your thoughts on how these might relate to their respective leadership styles?
Obviously, leadership style and personality are so intertwined that it does play out in that way as well. Just some highlights. Roosevelt, FDR, he goes and he just brings friends and family, or not even family. It's more just friends and close advisors. When you do the research for the readers, you'll probably get the feel that Roosevelt used Camp David more as like a men's club than anything else, because they would invite Supreme Court justices and other leaders up just to talk and to see the retreat. And it was only used in the summer because of the cold was just too cold and there wasn't any heat. But that plays into what FDR was like and the culture in the time then. We mentioned Eisenhower, how he would use it for work, and then Gettysburg for the family life. As a general, that's probably what he's like. This is a government facility, so I'm going to use it for government work more than anything else. Obviously, that's a direct reflection of his leadership style. Nixon, if Nixon had not been from California, I don't think he would have used it as much. Nixon, a very gregarious person, but he went up a lot, and mostly because of Watergate. Like once that started, the use went up, and he just would retreat to get away from everybody up there. We mentioned Johnson. He would bring people up, but his was more for work. He would he would bring a lot of friends and family. I think you never knew what you were going to get with Johnson as a leadership style or as a personality style, I should say. And so you never kind of knew what you were going to get in terms of the visit at Camp David. He invited, there was one time where he had Billy Graham and I want to say John Steinbeck or Hemingway, a famous writer up there together. And Lady Bird was like, I have no idea what these two have in common. He brings them together. So you have that. We talked about Reagan and George H.W. Bush was more family, did a little bit of work there, but it was more retreat. And that does fit into what the personality I have found in research. George W. Bush had a pretty good balance. He would bring a lot of work up there. He brought a lot of foreign leaders up just to talk to them away from the glare of the camera. But he did a lot of personal time as well. Every Christmas, George W. Bush was up there with his family. And then it tapered off. The use tapered off after Bush just because they had, the presidents had retreats nearby or had friends that would loan their houses out that they could stay at that was still safe and secure and could be themselves without having to go up the mountain. Not too close to DC, but far enough away that it could be a vacation. And so that's kind of been the trend since George W. Bush is most of the presidents have access to something close by that they felt more comfortable at. And that's fine. I think the comfort level of the president is important. And if they're comfortable, they'll use it. Or if they're more comfortable somewhere else, they're going to go there. I think the two most recent presidents, both Trump and Biden, favored their personal homes or their properties that were close by because that's just where they felt more comfortable and at ease. And I don't begrudge them that at all. Like the retreat is there for their use as they see fit.
Yes, it really, and that's one of the fascinating things. And, for our listeners, I think as you read this book, you really get a sense of these different personalities, and it really does dictate their approach to it. And you can see some folks who are really, focused on work, and they just really get into it as kind of that other office, kind of getting away to be able to focus in on work. But then you've got the folks who need that downtime, who need that time with their families. And it really comes across that the approach they take is different because they're different people and they take a different approach to their work and life and all of that. And it's fascinating to see it play out.
It is. And it's also fascinating to see who their friends are or who gets invited up. And for that, you have to rely on people saying it because there's no records of like so-and-so came up at this time. So it's interesting seeing some of the famous people that have come up over time. Because they were military and there were records for one of the fascinating things I found was that the astronauts from Apollo 13 to 16 got to spend time up there. The president wasn't there, but they and their spouses got to spend time after they got back to Earth. Arnold Schwarzenegger has been up there a number of times, and there's one famous incident where he's up in the winter during George H.W. Bush's presidency, and I think at the time he was the presidential fitness czar, if you will. And so he had been invited up, and they were sledding at the back hill outside of Aspen, and he jokingly said to Barbara, "Don't break your leg." What does she do? She breaks her leg and has to be taken down off the mountain. And then there's photos online from when Bill Clinton had the screening of Good Will Hunting at Camp David, and there's photos of the actors as part of that. And then the biggest celebrity is probably the one that was still being talked about when I showed up was Beyonce showed up and had her 35th birthday up there at the invitation of President Obama. So, those stories are few and far between, but it gives you a glimpse that there's probably a lot more of those out there. And so that gives a glimpse into who the president invites. And obviously, if the president invites somebody up, they're not going to say no because it's such a rare, special invitation. So you get to see the the friendship and the personality of people through their friends and who they invite up as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Charles, as we wrap up our conversation, I just wanted to ask, what do you feel is the key takeaway for readers of your book? And likewise, what did you take away from your research into the history of Camp David?
Both of those go together, the takeaways and what I found. I would want everybody, as they read the book, to realize that Camp David is the one place where a president can go and just be themselves with friends and family. You know, the White House is the people's house. You can make tours of the White House and get a lot closer. Whereas Camp David is the president's house, and it's exclusively for the president. There's a reason it's highly guarded, secure, and secretive, so they can be themselves. Because nowhere else offers this escape from the crush of the glare of social media and the press, the president and their guests and their family can be themselves and invite people up. It doesn't have to be a foreign leader, but they can invite friends and family and foreign leaders to be themselves, let the walls down, so that amazing things can really happen when people see each other as humans, not as caricatures or personas maybe characters that they play on TV. And when you get that ability to just talk to people on a human level with no pretension, miraculous world-changing things happen. And Camp David is proof of that formula. And that's what I would love people to take away from the book.
Well, and Charles, I know that's what I took away. I greatly appreciate your work and helping your readers and now our listeners to kind of understand what happens at this special place and how it can help us to better understand the individuals who have served as chief executive and their family and friends, the folks who are a big part of their life. I think it really helps us to better understand presidential history, to look at what happens in Camp David.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. I've totally enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you all the best with more conversations like this as this audience continues to grow.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for our audience, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Presidential Seclusion, The Power of Camp David. Charles, thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me.
Special thanks again to Charles Ferguson for joining me for this episode. A link to where you can purchase a copy of Charles's new book, Presidential Seclusion, The Power of Camp David, is available on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more resources about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the work of the Presidency's podcast. Special thanks to all of our patrons for their support, which helps the podcast to grow and to have the equipment and resources needed for this deep dive into presidential history. If you'd like to join our patrons in supporting this work for as little as $1 per month, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. If you haven't left a rating and review yet, I hope you'll take a moment to do so, as it helps folks to know why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. Thanks to all of you who have supported the podcast in various ways over the years. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. If you'd like to reach out to me, feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on social media if you don't follow me there already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Finally, I thank all of you for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
History is the greatest adventure story. But does it ever leave you wondering what the women were doing all that time? This is Lori from the Her Half of History podcast, and the answer is that some women were seizing power, or escaping slavery, or spying for their country, or creating artistic masterpieces, while countless others were doing the laundry, getting married, and wondering why their clothes don't have more pockets. If you would like to hear the stories of women doing all of those things, check out Her Half of History at herhalfofhistory.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
If a president cares to make DOJ an arm of his own political operation, he can do that. And there's not a heck of a lot we can do.
Why isn't the U.S. justice system able to hold the powerful to account?
So many guardrails, protections, norms, traditions have been discarded.
Why didn't Trump get indicted over the Jan 6 insurrection?
People wanted Mueller to say, I do find that he committed an indictable offense. Mueller did not say that.
Why aren't you listening to Disorder yet to find out? I'm Jason Pack. I'm a senior analyst at the NATO Foundation and the host of the Disorder podcast. Each week, alongside my rotating group of co-hosts and world-leading experts, we analyze why the world is so disordered, why disordering leaders make it worse, and then we ask, what can we, the individual, do to fix it?
The people matter as much or more than the rules.
This week, we're joined by Eli Honig, CNN's senior legal analyst. He and I look at exactly why the U.S. legal system isn't working and why Britain and other legal systems are.
People always say the Justice Department is independent or must be or should be independent. I agree should be, but it's not.
Search Disorder wherever you get your podcasts.